Chapter 2 Night Visitor. Along my spiritual path, I had been asking God for any enlightenment extent on the subject of life after death. I often wondered why, if this life is to prepare us for the next, are people so fearful of information about the next life? If you set out to study all you can about the afterlife, you will be amazed at how much information is published on the subject and how well that information dovetails together. The broad picture is vast and far-reaching. Even with all you can find, you will only be learning the smallest part of the vastness of God's creations. I ran across a book written by Betty Eady called Embraced by the Light. The book had only been out 2 months when a friend gave me a copy to read, and I stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning devouring its message. The book went on to be a bestseller, and I was able to chat with Betty at one time about her encounter. She was as sweet and loving on the phone as I had pictured she would be from her writings. More than anything else, this book let me feel through her experience the love of God and how close and personal He is. I realized that we are the ones that drive God away, and that there is nothing that I can do that will stop Him from loving me. My desire then became even greater to meet this Jesus, as His apostles had done after His death and resurrection. As I shared this book with others, I came across a photocopy of Robert Benson's book, Life in the World Unseen, as channeled through Anthony Borgia. I found myself astounded at its compatibility with what I had already learned from my LDS background. A person would have had to study all of his life on this subject to bring so many truths about the other side or spirit world together in the pages of one book. As I read it, I received witness after witness, that burning, loving feeling from God of its truths, and my insight and learning grew tremendously. His book also brought up a lot of new questions for which I couldn't find answers. So broad and expansive were his descriptions of the spirit life and the spirit world that I found my own religious teachings fell short. I also found that there is a great fear among religious sects today, my own included, of what the afterlife is like. I decided to research the author of this book and found Robert Hugh Benson had been a priest for the Church of England while in the flesh. As a priest, Benson had written about 20 religious books, which were basically along the same theological lines of his church. However, he later converted to Catholicism. Having labored in England as a missionary for the Mormon Church, I was acquainted with the basic philosophies of the Church of England and Catholic religions. I thus found it easy to understand Benson's concept of God. In 1914, at the age of 42, Robert Benson died after a short illness and passed on to what he called the spirit world. Here he found that a lot of what he had written as a priest was incorrect, and it troubled him that he had given out information that had become a stumbling block for many and was not helping them progress. After 25 years in the spirit world, he was granted the opportunity to come back to a friend and dictate a book or channeled information on what it was like to live in the spirit world as a spirit individual. His book gives a lot of details as to how this communication was done. He leaves few stones unturned, and his eloquent way of writing far overshadows my own. If it bothers you that the book was channeled, then take a look at all of Holy Writ and see if you can find any writings from God or the other side that are not channeled. If you think about it, you will conclude, as I did, that there is nothing written from God that is not channeled in some way. I felt compelled to get the message of this book out to people, and in the early part of 1993, I was able to obtain the rights to publish Benson's book in the United States, and began the process of getting it ready to go to press. When the book came out, I placed radio ads on a local LDS church-owned radio station, which was very skeptical of what their listeners would think about the book. To calm the station's fears, we decided to run the ads from midnight to 5 o'clock a.m. and see if they received any negative feedback. These ads were run at random times and because of the time frame were not too expensive. At about 4 o'clock a.m. on the third night of running their ads, I was awakened abruptly from a very sound sleep. It was as if someone had grabbed the front of my shirt and pulled me to a sitting position in bed. At the same time, I heard a voice say, "You need to listen to the ad on the radio right now." The voice was not harsh or demanding, but confident in its tone, if you can call it a tone of voice, for I could not distinguish whether I heard the sound with my ears or in my mind. For a moment I thought I must still be dreaming, and I started to lie back down when I was firmly pulled forward again, and the exact same words were repeated. At this point, I began to fumble around in the dark for the radio. This woke my wife up, and she asked sleepily, "What are you doing?" I said, "I need to listen to the ad on the radio." She said, "It's 4 in the morning. Go back to sleep." In the dark, I kept fumbling with the radio until it came on, and then I began to play with the unlit tuner. As I turned the knob, I came across the radio station the very second the ad started to play. My wife then sat up and asked, "What is going on?" I said, "I don't know, but I do know that I need to listen to the ad right now." When the ad finished, I set the radio down, and through the dark, I could see that my wife had a puzzled and somewhat fearful look. "Mike, there was someone here in our room." "No," I said. "There are 3 of them, and they are right over there." She pointed. Although I looked about the room and saw nothing out of the normal, I could distinctly feel or sense 3 individuals off to my right. The best way I can describe it is to say that they put off energy, and I instinctively knew they were males or that it was male energy. How exactly I knew this, I cannot say. It is difficult sometimes to describe how information from the spirit world is conveyed because much of the time it is received differently from the way in which we usually communicate knowledge. At the time, I don't remember thinking about being afraid or scared, but later I did look back on the experience and marvel at how calm I was, yet rather excited to have such an experience. Not knowing what to do next, I tried to relax, and immediately I heard a voice in my mind say, "I am Robert Benson, and I want to thank you for your interest in my behalf. If you have any questions about the spirit world, I am here to answer those questions." All of my communication with Robert and his 2 friends were done by speaking mentally back and forth. My wife and I would talk back and forth verbally, deciding what to ask, and then I would relax and mentally ask the question. The visitors would immediately answer in the same way. The answers were so clear and distinct that I asked my wife several times if she could hear what they were saying, but she could not. We asked every question we could think of, and I was surprised at some of the strange answers that Robert gave. This correspondence took place for about 40 minutes, after which time I began to feel extremely tired, even though I had just had most of a night's sleep. Robert and his friends seemed to ignore my need for a change in pace, so I point blank told them, "I need some rest. Either I need to go back to sleep or make love to my wife or something, but I need a change." To this they said nothing, but I could hear them communicating among themselves. As Robert and his 2 friends began to leave, their images came into view, and I could see them as one sees 3 friends walking away after a short chat. Whether this was with my physical eyes or spiritual eyes, I could not say, but I saw them without having to strain or concentrate. Then the one on the right looked back and said, "Enjoy it while you can." I was astonished at his apparent sense of humor, and it did leave a lasting impression on me. My greatest mistake was not writing down what we asked and what they said in return. Within 2 weeks, my wife and I could only remember about half of what was said in that 40-minute encounter. Still, it was just as real as me writing this now, and I basked in the joy of having had this breakthrough of the veil. As simple and comfortable as this encounter seemed, we came to the realization that we had actually talked with the dead, and our lives were changed. I knew from that moment on I would never be the same. I would never go to a funeral again and think of that person's body in the box as anything more than a pile of earth that at one time housed the personality of someone I knew. The real person, the life essence or spirit, was still as alive as it had ever been, but it was now free of the limitations and advantages of the physical body. As you may well imagine, I was very quiet about whom I told this experience and how. For a time, and out of fear of being ostracized, I kept the experience to myself, only telling my father and one or two trusted friends. Some very important truths came out of this meeting. Not that Robert and his friends told me anything so earth-shattering or profound, but what I learned about myself and how God works would change my life forever. First, I came to realize that the heavens are not sealed, that the other side, as we have come to call it, is a real place. It exists just as much as we do now. These personalities, or spirits as we on earth like to refer to them, have desires to grow, progress, and share what they know, just like we often do. Later on, I will explain this in more detail. Second, this place is accessible to anyone at any time. Worthiness has no bearing on whether you can talk to God or hear his voice or any other voice or person from the spirit world. This was a very radical shift from my upbringing. I had always been taught that the only way you could experience the things of God was by being worthy, with no real definition or sometimes too many definitions of what that word worthy meant. Then I remembered reading in the scriptures where God had called to Cain after Cain had just killed Abel and said, "Cain, where is thy brother?" Cain was a murderer, and yet God had just spoken to him. I felt even more sure that God could speak to me as well, even if it was not directly, but through a spirit named Robert Benson. If worthiness had no bearing on talking to God, then what did? Why were some able to do it and others not? Jesus gave the answer when he said, "If you believe, you can do all things." I was learning that belief is everything, for it is the foundation of faith. The idea of worthiness was something apart and has judgment written all over it. The power of believing that you can get through the veil is critical. If you exercise no faith that it will happen, I promise you that it won't. At the least, you must be neutral to the possibility of the world of spirit to even experience something from that realm that you don't understand. Third, I found that I had to be very flexible. If I had an agenda of how I thought it had to happen, then I was setting myself up for disappointment. This, too, was a difficult lesson to learn because others would tell me that God only worked a certain way, which of course they knew, even though they hadn't had any experience with God or someone from the spirit world speaking to them. When I gave up the idea that it had to happen for me as it had happened for someone else, things began to move forward at a faster pace. I was taking God out of the box where I had put him or her, there's another box, and tearing down the barriers that had blocked my mind to learning more truth. That is not to say that I was wrong in my first thinking or my early understanding of God, but that I was now building upon what I had learned, and that enabled me to go further than I had before. At least I was seeing a shift in myself and progress being made. I also noticed that if I found I was being criticized by those who didn't understand the changes that were taking place in my life, or if they felt that I was not going about this the right way, then I tried to look at the kind of person they were and what they had accomplished in their lives. There are many places in the Holy Writ, and even Jesus said, "By their fruits ye shall know them." I had to ask myself, were my actions and accomplishments loving, kind, and gentle? Was I at peace with myself and God? And how about those who didn't understand? Were they displaying these loving attributes? If not, should I be heeding their advice?